So you're walking to work to start what should be a quiet night shift, and you witness something that shouldn't exist. It's a massive silent craft hovering over your workplace. Strange enough, right? But what if I told you that that's just the beginning? What if that single encounter gave you the ability to see the future, to read people's minds, to accidentally destroy every electrical device that you touch? Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to The Oddest. What I've just described to you is exactly what happened to Steve Robbins back in 1981, and this case might hold the key to understanding something extraordinary about human consciousness itself. This isn't just another UFO story. This is about what happens when the impossible collides with the everyday and changes everything forever. Right, so let's talk about something that's been nagging me for weeks. I've been digging through lesser known UFO cases from Britain, and I stumbled across this absolute gem from 1981 that barely anyone talks about. And honestly, I can't figure out why, because it's one of the most detailed and frankly unsettling encounters that I've ever come across. Now, I know what you're thinking, this is just another UFO video, Johnny, but hear me out please, because this case from Teesside isn't just about lights in the sky, it's about what happens after the encounter. It's about a man whose entire reality shifted overnight, who gained abilities that he never asked for, and who's been living with the consequences for over 4 decades. The thing that fascinates me about the Steve Robbins experience is that it challenges everything we know about these types of encounters. Usually we focus on the craft, the beings, the technology, but what if the real story isn't what people see? It's what happens to them afterwards. Go and grab yourself a wee cup of tea and settle in, and let me tell you about a case that might just change how you think about consciousness, reality, and what it truly means to be human. To understand what actually happened to Steve Robbins, we need to set the scene properly. So, it's June 1981 and we're in Teesside in England, an industrial area packed with chemical plants, refineries and power facilities. Steve's working the night shifts at the Phillips Petroleum plant. He's just an ordinary bloke doing his job, supporting his wife and 2 sons. By all accounts, Steve was pretty typical before this incident. He worked hard, enjoyed a pint at the pub, he paid his mortgage and he looked after his family. He described himself as sceptical but open-minded about things like UFOs. He was the sort of person who wouldn't dismiss something outright, but he certainly wasn't out there hunting for little green men. This is very important because what makes Steve's case so compelling isn't just what he experienced, but who he was before this happened. This wasn't someone predisposed to fantasy or looking for attention. This was just a hard grafting shift worker who just wanted to get through his night shift and then go home to his family. But here's where it gets interesting. Steve wasn't completely ordinary. He had had some fairly unusual experiences as a kid, out-of-body experiences, sensing communication from somewhere else. His grandmother on his mother's side also experienced paranormal phenomena. So perhaps there was something else there, lying dormant, just waiting for the right trigger. That trigger came just before midnight on one June night in 1981. Right, so it's 10 minutes to midnight and Steve's making his way back to the control room when he looks up at the sky. What he sees stops him dead in his tracks. There's this massive object flying between 2 of the plant towers. Now we're talking something around 100 feet long and 25 feet wide. That's absolutely enormous. To put that into perspective, that's longer than a blue whale, just hanging there in the sky above the industrial plant. Steve watches as this thing moves in a downward trajectory, heading straight for 4 huge crude oil receiving spheres. Now he's thinking to himself that it's going to crash, but it's moving slowly, deliberately, completely under control. And here's the strange thing, despite its massive size, the thing is completely silent. As it passes directly overhead, Steve gets a proper good look at it. It's cigar-shaped, metallic, dull blue steel colour with this strange luminescence, like a neon light. The glow is particularly bright around its edges, pulsating this bright white yellow light. It's otherworldly, but also strangely industrial, if that makes sense. Now, Steve watches in absolute panic as this thing approaches the oil spheres. It clears them by barely a foot. Barely a foot. He jumps on his bike and pedals frantically around to the other side of these spheres, expecting to see where this craft has gone. Absolutely nothing there. It's as if the thing just vanished into thin air. Steve then rushes back to the control room where his colleagues are having their meal break. The moment that he walks in, they can see obviously that something's wrong with him. One of them actually said, "Mate, you look like you've seen a ghost." And in a way, maybe he had. He blurts out what he had just witnessed, and to their credit, his colleagues and supervisor, they didn't dismiss him completely. They all ran outside to investigate what was going on. But of course, there's nothing there. The supervisor contacts Teesside Airport. No aircraft activity. No planes landing or taking off in the past hour. They contact RAF Flyingdales, who start asking Steve questions about this UFO report. But here's what makes this case special. Steve wasn't the only witness. He starts calling around different departments at the plant, and eventually he speaks to a security guard who is stationed at the tank farm about 1.5 miles away. This guard describes seeing an almost identical object at that exact same time, heading in the same direction that Steve had observed. So that's two independent witnesses separated by a significant distance, describing the same impossible object. That's not mass hysteria or a shared delusion, that's corroboration. And then the supervisor drops another bombshell. So about a month earlier, another employee had reported seeing a very similar object attempting to land on the plant's main road. This wasn't an isolated incident. Something had been visiting this industrial site. Now, if this story ended there, it would be remarkable enough. But what happened next is where things get truly, truly bizarre, and where Steve's case becomes something far more profound than just another UFO sighting. So a few days after this encounter, Steve's at home watching TV with his wife when the television suddenly bursts into flames. Now, I don't mean it malfunctions, it didn't smoke or spark, actual flames. They had to throw the thing out of the window to stop the fire from spreading. The television was only 3 years old. Over the next 3 days, and always when Steve was present, electrical appliances started failing left and right. The Hoover, the toaster, the hairdryer, the iron, an alarm clock, even a battery-powered portable radio and an electric drill all failed in his presence. It's like Steve had become some sort of electromagnetic anomaly. The electricity board came out, installed voltage recorders, they ran every test that they could think of. There was nothing wrong with the property. The neighbours, they weren't experiencing any problems. 2 separate electrical engineers were completely baffled by what was going on there. But it wasn't just at home. At work, computer terminals would go out of sync whenever Steve was standing around. Something that had absolutely never happened before this encounter. Then, 2 years later in 1983, when he worked offshore, the same problems followed him there. Wherever Steve went, electrical systems seemed to rebel against his presence. This is where the case becomes genuinely unsettling, because we're not just talking about a UFO sighting anymore. We're talking about a fundamental change in how this man's body interacted with the world around him. But the electrical problems, they were just the beginning. 2 weeks after this sighting, Steve experienced something that sounds like it's straight out of a sci-fi horror movie. He's asleep in his bed when suddenly he's awakened by a high-pitched humming sound in his ears. He tries to move and then realises that he can't. He's completely paralysed, flat on his back, unable to move a single muscle. But his eyes, they're open and they seem to work. And as they adjust to the darkness, he realises he's not alone. There are 3 or 4 figures in that room, dressed in black, barely visible except for their dull, cloak-like habits. Steve tries to scream out, but he can't make a single sound, just a slight gurgling noise in his throat. Then things get even stranger. These entities start communicating with him, not through voices or words as we understand them, but through what Steve later describes as thought transference. He doesn't understand their language at all, but somehow he comprehends their meaning. They tell him that no harm will come to him, his wife, or his children. They assure him His wife will now know nothing about this. Steve tries desperately to move, to wake himself up, convinced that it's just a dream and he just has to wake up. But he can feel sweat trickling down his forehead and into his eyes. It's not a dream. This is happening. The entities communicate that they want just you for a little while. Steve blacks out, and the next thing he knows, it's dawn and he can move again. The figures are gone, and he's left with his overwhelming feeling of being grimy and dirty, as though he had been on a long journey somewhere. This wasn't a one-off incident. Steve had several more of these experiences over the following 2 years. What happened next might be the most extraordinary part of this entire case. Steve began having precognitive dreams. Not ordinary dreams, but what he described as disturbingly powerful and compelling visions with a quality so real they were impossible to ignore. Among these visions were the Chernobyl nuclear disaster and the Lockerbie bombing, both of which he dreamt about 6 months before they ever happened. When he saw the Lockerbie news reports, he was in total shock at how familiar the scene looked. The researcher that was interviewing him years later said Steve became so emotional discussing his dream that they had to take a break from the interview. But it wasn't just precognition. Steve discovered that he could tune into people. The moment he met them, reading their thoughts, understanding their inner lives with disturbing clarity. He found this ability so intrusive and uncontrollable that he actively tried to shut down his brain and switch it off. Think about what this means. A man who had been completely ordinary just a few months before was now experiencing abilities that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of human consciousness. He could see the future, he could read minds. His very presence disrupted any electrical systems. So what the hell actually happened to Steve Robbins? Researchers have put forward several theories, and none of them are entirely satisfying. Some suggested hallucinations caused by gas or oil from the chemical plant, but that doesn't exactly explain the security guard who then saw the same object over a mile away. Joint hallucinations aren't really how human brains work. Albert Budden, a researcher into electromagnetic phenomena, suggested that electromagnetic fields in the area, well, they might have triggered Steve's experiences. Teesside itself is packed with chemical and power facilities, so there's certainly electromagnetic activity there. This might explain some of the electrical malfunctions, but it doesn't account for the multiple witnesses or the specific details of what was actually seen. Sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations could explain the bedroom visitors. These are well-documented phenomena where people experience paralysis and hallucinations while transitioning between sleep and the waking states. It's happened to me a bunch of times since I was a kid, and it is terrifying. But Steve was adamant that these experiences felt completely different from normal dreams. Here's what I think might be happening, and this is where the case really becomes fascinating. What if some people are naturally sensitive to forces or energies that we don't understand? What if Steve already had dormant abilities? I mean, remember, he'd had unusual experiences when he was a child, right? And his grandmother also experienced paranormal phenomena too. Maybe the UFO encounter didn't give Steve these abilities. Maybe it activated something that was already there. Gloria Dixon, the researcher who documented Steve's case, made a fascinating observation. She noted that many people who have close encounters with UFOs develop similar abilities afterwards. Sometimes precognition, telepathy, the ability to affect electrical devices. The pattern is so common that she suggested the gateways between reports of close encounter experiences and subsequent paranormal events are linked in a way that we have yet to understand. This raises an extraordinary possibility. What if UFO encounters aren't random events? What if they are somehow connected to human consciousness in ways that we cannot comprehend? What if certain people are selected or targeted because they have latent abilities that can be awakened? Steve himself changed dramatically after his experience. Before 1981, he was focused on work and his family and the occasional pint in the pub. Afterward, he became deeply philosophical, interested in environmental issues. He started writing poetry, something that he had never considered before. He developed an unshakable belief that life is just a current phase of eternity. As he said to researchers later on, these experiences have changed my life, but it wasn't one blinding flash type overnight wonder. It has been much more subtle, a slow realization process. Steve Robbins' case challenges everything that we know about UFO encounters. This isn't just about strange crafts in the sky, it's about the transformation of human consciousness. It suggests that some of us might have extraordinary abilities just lying dormant, waiting for the right trigger to awaken them. Over 40 years later, Steve still lives with the consequences of that night back in June of 1981. He's learned to accept what happened to him, even if he can't explain it. But here's what I want to know, and I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts on this. Have any of you ever experienced electrical devices malfunctioning around you? Have you ever had dreams that later came true? Because if Steve's case teaches us anything, it's that the line between ordinary and extraordinary might be far thinner than we originally thought. Drop your experiences in the comments below, and if this case has got you thinking about the nature of consciousness and reality, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that challenge everything we know about our world. Until next time folks, stay safe out there please, tell someone that you love them, and remember, no matter what, keep smiling.